Before central heating and insulation, surviving winter was more than just uncomfortable. It was a real challenge. Medieval peasants had to get creative, using whatever they could to fight the cold. Some of their ideas might surprise you, and you'll definitely be grateful for your warm home. Medieval peasant houses weren't exactly architectural marvels. Most were simple one-room structures with walls made of wattle and daub, essentially woven sticks plastered with a mixture of clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. It was like living in a primitive papier-mâché project, except less waterproof and more likely to house uninvited rodent guests. The floors were typically packed earth mixed with straw. Practical, but not exactly what you'd call cozy by today's standards. This earthen floor would be covered with fresh rushes or straw periodically, creating layers of insulation against the cold ground. The decomposing bottom layers actually generated small amounts of heat as they broke down, providing a subtle warmth from below. Think of it as nature's underfloor heating system, with the added bonus of interesting smells and the occasional beetle surprise. These homes usually featured just one main room where the entire family lived, worked, ate, and slept. This wasn't a design choice based on togetherness, it was pure survival economics. Heating one room took far less fuel than heating several, and the shared body heat from family members helped maintain a somewhat bearable temperature. Research suggests that each human body gives off roughly the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb. In a small space with 5 or 6 people, that's equal to a modest space heater. The roofs were typically thatched with straw, reeds, or heather, which provided surprisingly effective insulation. A well-made thatch roof could be up to 3 feet thick, creating an excellent barrier against cold air. These roofs were so effective that some studies of reconstructed medieval buildings show they retained up to 30% more heat than modern tiled roofs without proper insulation. Windows were either tiny or non-existent in most peasant homes. When they did exist, they were often covered with oiled parchment or cloth rather than glass, which was far too expensive for common folk. These small openings minimized heat loss while still providing minimal ventilation and a hint of light. It's like they invented the concept of mood lighting centuries before romantic restaurants made it popular. Doors were another weak point for heat retention, so they were kept small and sometimes covered with heavy fabric curtains to block drafts. Some clever peasants even built small entryways or wind lobbies that created an airlock of sorts, preventing gusts of freezing air from directly entering the main living space. Perhaps most importantly, medieval homes weren't just for humans. Livestock often shared the living space, especially in the coldest months. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens would be brought inside, adding their body heat to the mix. A single cow can generate as much heat as a small wood stove, making them valuable winter housemates despite their less appealing qualities. Nothing says cozy winter evening quite like sharing your bedroom with a flatulent cow. With all these elements combined, the house itself served as the first line of defense against winter's bite. But keeping warm required more than just 4 walls and a roof. The heart of every medieval home was, quite literally, the hearth. Unlike our modern fireplaces tucked neatly against a wall with efficient chimneys, the medieval hearth was typically placed right in the center of the single-room dwelling. This central placement wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a practical one. Heat radiates in all directions, so a centrally located fire warmed the entire space more evenly. What might surprise you is that early medieval homes often didn't have chimneys at all. Instead, smoke from the fire would fill the upper portion of the room before eventually finding its way out through a hole in the roof called a smoke hole or louvre. The medieval version of air purification was basically hope the smoke finds the exit before your lungs give out. No wonder smoky eye was the only makeup look available. This smoky environment, while uncomfortable by modern standards, served several unexpected purposes. The smoke actually helped preserve the structural integrity of the thatch roof by deterring insects and rodents. It also created a natural food preservation system. Meat and fish could be hung from the rafters where the rising smoke would cure them, extending their shelf life through the winter months when fresh food was scarce. Medieval refrigeration. Just hang your bacon where the smoke is thickest and hope your dinner guests don't mind the hint of chimney flavor. Managing the hearth fire was both an art and a science. Wood was a valuable resource, especially in areas where deforestation had occurred due to population growth and agricultural expansion. By the late medieval period, some regions of Europe had lost up to 70% of their original forest cover, making firewood increasingly expensive and hard to come by. To conserve this precious resource, peasants rarely kept their fires burning continuously. Instead, they would bank the fire, covering hot coals with ash to preserve heat while using minimal fuel, and only build it up when necessary for cooking or during the coldest hours. Many households developed a fire-sharing system where a child might be sent to a neighbor's home with an ember carrier to borrow fire if their own had gone out. Medieval kids didn't just borrow sugar from neighbors, they borrowed the ability to not freeze to death. When wood was scarce, medieval peasants got creative with alternative fuels. Dried peat cut from bogs was commonly used in northern regions, while dried dung from cattle, horses, and other livestock served as a surprisingly effective fuel source elsewhere. Nothing warms your hands quite like a roaring fire fueled by last month's cow droppings. Talk about recycling before it was cool. The tools for managing the fire were simple but specialized. Fire irons, pot hooks, and trivets allowed cooking over the open flame, while fire covers could partially smother the fire to conserve fuel during the night. A well-equipped peasant home might also have a bellows for quickly stoking the flames when needed. The medieval bellows was essentially the first leaf blower, except instead of annoying your neighbors on Sunday morning, it kept your family from freezing. Fire safety was a serious concern, especially given the flammable nature of thatch roofs and wooden structures. Most settlements had strict regulations about when fires could be lit and when they had to be extinguished. The evening curfew in many medieval towns, signaled by the ringing of a bell, originated partly as a fire safety measure, requiring all fires to be covered or extinguished for the night. Despite these precautions, fires were the greatest disaster that could befall a medieval community. Many towns burned to the ground multiple times throughout their history. London experienced major fires in 1133, 1212, and of course the Great Fire of 1666, which destroyed over 13,000 homes. Medieval fire departments consisted mainly of people forming bucket chains and yelling, "Not again!" The hearth provided more than just physical warmth. It was the social center of the home where families gathered, meals were prepared, and stories were told on long winter nights. But when the fire died down and the bitter cold of night set in, medieval peasants needed additional strategies to stay warm. The wardrobe of a typical medieval peasant bore little resemblance to our modern concept of fashion, prioritizing function over form in every possible way. Wool reigned supreme as the most important material for winter clothing. Sheep were widespread throughout medieval Europe, making wool relatively accessible even to the poorest members of society. Wool's natural properties made it ideal for cold weather. It retains heat even when wet and creates pockets of warm air when layered. Medieval wool was typically coarser and heavier than modern varieties, providing exceptional insulation at the cost of comfort. Scratchy sweaters from your grandma have nothing on medieval wool garments. They were essentially wearable hedgehogs that doubled as anti-cuddling devices. Contrary to popular belief, peasants didn't just wear a single ragged garment. Layering was understood as essential for survival. A typical winter outfit for a man might include linen undergarments, wool leggings, a wool tunic, a heavier overtunic, and a cloak. Women would wear similar layers with linen shifts under wool dresses, often with additional petticoats and aprons adding valuable insulation. The linen undergarments served a crucial purpose beyond modesty. They created an inner layer that absorbed sweat while providing a barrier between rough wool and sensitive skin. This layering system created multiple pockets of trapped air, much like modern thermal clothing. Peasants understood the principle of insulation centuries before it became a scientific concept. They were engineering toasty microclimates, while the nobles were too busy figuring out how to make their ridiculous pointy shoes even pointier. Headwear was considered essential, not optional. Medieval people knew that significant body heat escapes from the head, and various forms of caps, coifs, and hoods were worn day and night during cold months. Many of these head coverings extended to protect the neck and shoulders as well, areas particularly vulnerable to drafts. Medieval fashion gave us many things, but hat hair might be its most enduring legacy. Bedhead was simply Tuesday through Sunday hair in the 1300s. Footwear posed a particular challenge. Leather shoes were common, but offered little insulation against cold ground. The solution was to stuff shoes with dried grass, moss, or straw, creating natural insulation. Wealthier peasants might have wooden pattens, essentially medieval galoshes, that lifted feet above the cold, wet ground. For those who couldn't afford leather shoes, simple fabric wrappings bound with cord served as makeshift boots. Nothing says winter fashion quite like feet that smell like a stable and sound like a squirrel nest when you walk. The medieval cloak deserves special mention as perhaps the most versatile garment in a peasant's arsenal against the cold. These large pieces of wool fabric could be wrapped in various ways depending on the weather, serving as coats during the day and blankets at night. Some cloaks featured hoods, while others were worn with separate head coverings. The most prized cloaks were those made from fulled wool, a process of washing, beating, and shrinking the fabric to create an even denser, more windproof material. Gloves or mittens were rare luxuries for most peasants. Instead, they often used hand coverings made from scrap fabric or simply tucked their hands into their sleeves or cloaks. The fingerless mitten design, leaving the fingertips exposed for work while covering the palm and back of the hand, was a practical medieval innovation that remains popular today. Apparently, the "I need to text but it's cold" solution was invented centuries before smartphones. When traveling between villages in winter, peasants employed additional strategies. Fabric could be stuffed between layers for extra insulation. Some would sew small pouches of dried herbs or spices into their clothes, believing these warming agents would help heat the blood. Whether these botanical additions had any real effect is debatable, but the psychological comfort surely helped. But clothing alone wasn't enough to fight the bitter cold of a medieval winter night. As darkness fell completely, other survival strategies came into play. When night fell completely in medieval winter, surviving until morning often depended on one crucial resource: shared body heat. The sleeping arrangements in a peasant home were designed to maximize warmth through proximity, a stark contrast to our modern obsession with personal space and private bedrooms. Most peasant families slept in a single room, often on a large communal bed or sleeping platform. These weren't the separate mattresses we might imagine today. Instead, they typically consisted of a wooden frame filled with straw, which was covered with whatever fabric or furs the family could afford. Richer households might have feather mattresses, while the poorest might sleep directly on straw-covered floors. The entire family, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even unmarried relatives or servants, would sleep together on this platform. They arranged themselves strategically, with the youngest and oldest most vulnerable to cold placed in the middle where it was warmest. Medieval sleeping arrangements would horrify today's teenagers who need their privacy to text. Back then, your grandmother could literally read your dreams. Surprisingly, medieval beds were often shorter than modern ones. This wasn't because people were significantly shorter, but because many people slept in a semi-sitting position, believing that lying flat was unhealthy and associated with death. Pillows weren't common, with most people using rolled cloaks or bundles of straw to prop themselves up. Covers consisted of whatever could be spared: woolen blankets, old cloaks, furs if the family was lucky, and sometimes even dried rush mats. Many of these coverings did double duty during the day as clothing. Some regions developed specific bed coverings like the Welsh tapestry blanket, woven from wool with distinct patterns that helped identify family origins. The human body generates approximately 75 watts of heat when resting. Multiply that by 5 or 6 family members huddled together, and you get an effective heating system of around 400 watts, comparable to a small modern space heater. This shared warmth could raise the temperature of a small enclosed sleeping area by as much as 15 degrees, potentially the difference between freezing and surviving a bitter winter night. But humans weren't the only heat sources in medieval homes during winter nights. Domesticated animals were brought inside not just for their protection, but for their valuable body heat. A single cow generates about 500 watts of heat, more than all human family members combined, making livestock excellent winter housemates despite their other less pleasant attributes. Chickens might be kept in baskets under the bed, while smaller mammals like dogs were often encouraged to sleep on the bed itself. Imagine trying to explain to a medieval peasant why modern people kick their dogs off the bed. You mean you have this furry heating device and you don't use it? Even the family pig might be brought inside during the coldest nights, usually relegated to its own corner or pen within the home. Pigs are particularly good heat generators, producing around 400 watts each, roughly equivalent to a small modern space heater. Medieval ASMR was just animal sounds and grandpa's snoring. The boundaries of personal space were vastly different in medieval times, shaped by necessity rather than preference. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply wasn't an option when survival depended on shared warmth. Historical records and literature suggest this constant proximity affected how people viewed personal boundaries, with individuals becoming accustomed to constant physical contact in ways that would seem intrusive by modern standards. Villages sometimes established communal warming houses where those without families could gather during the coldest nights. These spaces would be maintained by the community, with everyone contributing fuel or labor. Such arrangements helped ensure the survival of widows, widowers, and others who lacked the protection of family body heat. While these communal sleeping methods were crucial for winter survival, they had other benefits too. Once warmed by shared body heat, peasants could make the most of the long winter nights. Winter meant shorter days and longer nights for medieval peasants, and they adapted their activities accordingly. Unlike today's world where electric lights let us ignore natural cycles, medieval people followed the rhythm of the sun, which meant their winter days started later and ended earlier. A typical winter day might begin around 7 a.m. when the weak sunlight finally made work possible and end by 4 p.m. when darkness fell. This gave peasants significantly fewer working hours than during summer when they might labor from dawn at 4 a.m. until dusk at 9 p.m. Their version of winter hours wasn't a corporate policy, but more of a can't see my hand in front of my face, so I might as well sleep situation. This natural reduction in daylight created what historians now recognize as a different winter lifestyle. Evidence from medieval records shows that many communities expected less work during winter months. Agricultural labor decreased dramatically, with much of the time spent on indoor tasks like repairing tools, spinning wool, and weaving. One fascinating aspect of medieval winter sleep patterns was what scholars call segmented sleep. Many people would sleep in two distinct phases: a first sleep beginning shortly after darkness fell, followed by a wakeful period of 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep until morning. During this midnight waking period, people would tend the fire, pray, talk quietly, or sometimes even visit neighbors. These midnight social hours created unique bonding opportunities. Records from this era mention people sharing dreams, telling stories, or discussing community matters during these nocturnal interludes. Staying up until midnight wasn't considered partying, it was just Tuesday. Their version of midnight texting was actual face-to-face conversation. The extended darkness also meant more time for rest. Medieval winter sleep patterns often included 8 to 10 hours of total sleep time, plus additional periods of rest by the fire. This extra sleep served a practical purpose. The body burns fewer calories when sleeping, making it an effective strategy for conserving energy when food supplies were limited. Interestingly, many religious customs and festivals took advantage of these winter sleep patterns. Night masses and Christmas Eve celebrations capitalized on the natural midnight waking period, while early morning religious observances were scheduled later in winter than in summer. While the seasonal rhythm provided some benefits, it also created challenges. The long, dark evenings could trigger what we now recognize as seasonal depression. Medieval remedies included communal gatherings, storytelling traditions, and winter festivals designed specifically to combat the psychological effects of darkness and confinement. But to survive those long winter nights, medieval peasants needed more than just sleep schedules and entertainment. During harsh medieval winters, the food people ate wasn't just about survival, it was an important source of warmth. The most popular winter meals were thick, hearty stews that combined whatever ingredients were available from autumn harvests and preserved stores. These calorie-rich concoctions provided crucial internal heating as the body worked to digest them. Preservation techniques allowed medieval peasants to maintain a varied, if limited, diet throughout winter. Salt-preserved meats, smoked fish, dried fruits, nuts, and root vegetables stored in cool, dry places formed the backbone of winter nutrition. The human body generates more heat when digesting foods high in protein and fat, making these preserved items especially valuable. Bread remained a staple year-round, often making up more than half of a peasant's daily calories. Winter bread was typically denser and darker than summer varieties. The process of making bread, kneading, rising, and baking, also added welcome warmth to the home. Medieval baking shows weren't about fancy decorations, but rather how many people can huddle around this oven without getting third-degree burns. Spices played a surprising role in medieval winter comfort, at least for those who could afford them. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were believed to heat the blood and warm the body from within. The medieval belief that garlic and onions provided internal heat turns out to have some basis, in fact, as these foods can slightly increase metabolism. Creative warming methods involved more than just eating. Hot stones from the fire would be wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of beds, or sometimes in pockets for portable warmth. In some regions, people filled fabric pouches with heated grain, creating the world's first hot water bottles without the water. Nothing says, "I love you" in medieval times like a pouch of scorching hot barley shoved under your feet at bedtime. Drinks were particularly important in the winter survival toolkit. Hot ales infused with honey and spices were popular winter warmers, creating a glowing feeling in the stomach that temporarily counteracted the chill. For special occasions or particularly bitter cold spells, communities might pool resources for feasting. These communal meals served multiple purposes, sharing limited resources, generating social heat through crowded gathering spaces, and boosting morale during the darkest part of the year. Records from medieval villages show increases in community gatherings during the coldest months, suggesting this was a deliberate survival strategy. One unique medieval approach to staying warm involved changing eating schedules during winter. With less daylight for work, peasants would typically eat their largest meal earlier in the day, allowing their bodies to generate digestive heat during the coldest hours rather than while sleeping. Medieval dietitians weren't worried about eating after 6 p.m. making you gain weight. They were worried about wasting precious food warm while unconscious. The ritual of gathering around a steaming pot after a day of freezing work provided emotional comfort that was just as important as the physical warmth. Winter meals were typically served in wooden bowls, which retained heat better than metal or ceramic, allowing people to warm their hands while eating. These many methods of warming from the inside out complemented all the external warming techniques, creating a comprehensive survival system that got medieval people through winter after winter. And through it all, they also found ways to adapt their daily routines to the season's unique challenges.